It's been nearly 3 decades since Christa Pike became the youngest woman sentenced to death in the US. Now, her time on death row is coming to an end, with her execution date finally set. Before she became one of the most infamous names in Tennessee's criminal history, Christa Pike was just a child, growing up in an environment marked by instability and neglect. She came into the world on March 10, 1976, in Beckley, West Virginia, born to Emil Glenn Pike and Carissa Hansen. Her childhood was full of family drama and not much guidance. These early years would set the stage for the path her life eventually took, and it's a story that would make her name infamous far beyond her small hometown. Krista's parents had a messy, on again, off again relationship that really shaped her early life. Emil and Carissa couldn't seem to make it work. They married, divorced, remarried, and then divorced again. That kind of constant fighting and breakups became her normal, so she grew up in a house full of conflict without the steady home most kids have. Her mom, Carissa, had her own struggles and sometimes made choices that left Krista without the care she needed. She even tried to take her own life at one point, which just added to the chaos. Her dad was in her life, but it was far from consistent. After he remarried, Krista would sometimes stay with him and his new family, but it wasn't permanent. Tensions there eventually caused another split, leaving her again without a real sense of stability or a place where she felt like she belonged. Even as a young kid, Krista's life was tougher than what most kids have to deal with. People who knew her later said her home life was chaotic and unstructured. Her mom could be sweet and affectionate sometimes, but often she was off doing her own thing, her social life, her responsibilities, and that left Krista with way too little supervision. On top of that, Krista had seizures as a toddler, which really needed careful medical attention. But according to family members, the care she got was inconsistent at best. Some relatives tried to help out, but overall, her needs weren't fully met. The lack of consistent medical care kind of mirrored the emotional instability at home.
She spanked her for everything. But I would go in and I would find this baby crawling around through piles of dog stool all over the house. It was never clean.
Krista's paternal grandmother was probably the most important figure in her early life. Krista often said that her grandmother was the only person who truly loved her, and their bond was really deep. She didn't just provide affection, she gave Krista a sense of safety, comfort, and grounding. For a young girl in such an unstable household, that relationship was like a lifeline. But that stability didn't last. When Krista was about 12, her grandmother passed away. For her, it was devastating. Losing the one person who had been always there for her left her feeling completely adrift in a world that already felt unpredictable. The grief she carried from that loss weighed heavily on her, and she struggled to find ways to cope with it. Even before her grandmother passed away, it was clear that Krista was dealing with some serious emotional struggles. By the time she was in third grade, she had already attempted suicide, which really shows just how much pain she was carrying as a kid. After that attempt, she did get some psychological support, including counseling, but like so many other things in her life, it wasn't consistent. It came in little bursts rather than steady, long term care. As she went through her teenage years, Krista kept wrestling with her mental health. She often felt very alone, and her sense of self worth was pretty fragile. The instability at home and the lack of guidance from her parents made it really hard for her to build resilience. She was smart and showed potential, but her school performance suffered because of all the emotional weight she was carrying and the constant disruptions in her life. Her teen years brought even more challenges. She moved between different households, schools, and environments so often that she never really got the chance to form lasting friendships or feel grounded anywhere. This made it nearly impossible for her to feel secure or trust that relationships, or anything really, would last. The tension in her family kept getting worse, and she often found herself arguing or clashing with the people around her. She had a temper, and sometimes she lashed out in anger. When she was with her mom, she'd sometimes butt heads with her mother's boyfriends, and the situations could get pretty heated. At her dad's house, things with his new family eventually fell apart too, and she ended up being sent away. Every time something like that happened, it just reinforced the feeling that she didn't truly belong anywhere. Still, Krista wasn't completely without hope. She had dreams. She wanted to make something of herself and build a better, more stable life. But the reality of her situation kept pulling her off track, no matter how much she might have wanted things to be different. By the time she reached 10th grade, things had gotten so bad that she ended up in a juvenile facility for about a year. The structure there gave her some routine, but it didn't really help with the deeper emotional wounds she carried. In 1994, Christa enrolled at the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, a place meant to help young people get their lives on track by teaching them skills and giving them a sense of structure. At first, Christa seemed to take the opportunity seriously. It was a fresh start, a chance to move past the chaos of her childhood and focus on her future. While she was there, she met another student, Daryl Ship. The two quickly became inseparable. Their connection was intense, maybe too intense, and before long, they were spending nearly all their time together.
Daryl was respected, if not feared. He protected me. He was probably the first man that I'd ever had in my life that wanted to protect me, that saw me as, you know, a treasure, something good instead of something to use and toss to the side.
For Krista, who had spent so much of her life feeling alone and unwanted, Daryl made her feel seen and accepted. He filled the emotional void she'd carried for years, but their relationship also took a dark turn. They started to share some disturbing interests, diving into ideas and beliefs that reflected the pain and anger they both carried inside. Around others, they seemed wrapped up in their own little world, one that blurred the line between fantasy and reality. On paper, she was doing well. She was training to become a nursing assistant, but emotionally, she was still haunted by her past. When you look into Daryl Ship's life, what immediately stands out is how little is actually known about him. Unlike Krista, whose childhood and background were picked apart by the media and the courts, Daryl stayed mostly in the background, a quieter figure who never drew much attention. There aren't many details about his upbringing, but the bits and pieces that do exist suggest a life that wasn't easy. He grew up without much stability or direction, and like Krista, he seemed to be searching for something, a purpose, maybe even a sense of belonging. Whatever his struggles were, they eventually led him to the same place as hers, the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee, in 1994. That's where their worlds collided, and from that point on, their lives became permanently intertwined. In early 1995, the Daryl Ship was just 17, a teenager growing up in a world that wasn't exactly easy to navigate. Born in the late 1970s, he came of age during a time when Tennessee, like much of the South, was dealing with poverty, crime, and limited opportunities. For a lot of families back then, simply getting by was a daily challenge. Job Corps wasn't the kind of place wealthy or well connected teens went. It was designated for young people who needed a second chance, those who had dropped out of school, grown up in unstable homes, or just didn't have the support or guidance to find a clear direction in life. So, while we don't have all the details, the Daryl's enrollment there paints a pretty clear picture. He likely came from a rough background, one where steady support, good schooling, and a stable family life were hard to come by. Job Corps may have been his shot at building something better, a way to escape whatever chaos or dead ends he'd grown up with. Many of the students who came to Job Corps carried heavy baggage from rough upbringings, and when you packed hundreds of struggling young people into one place with minimal supervision, problems were bound to happen. The Knoxville Center, especially in the mid 1990s, had a reputation for being rough. Students talked about constant tension, threats, and fights breaking out. It wasn't unusual for young men to posture or act tough to avoid becoming targets themselves. It was part survival, part pride. In a place where fitting in would mean the difference between being respected or pushed around, Ship seemed determined to make sure people knew who he was. What really stands out in the stories people told about the Daryl Ship is how fast he built a reputation, and not a good one. Other students at the Knoxville Job Corps remembered him as someone you didn't want to mess with. He had a quick temper and a way of intimidating people that made them keep their distance. There were constant rumors about him, warnings passed quietly from one student to another. His presence alone seemed to make people uneasy. When people later talked about his relationship with Christa Pike, one thing kept coming up: how much influence he seemed to have over her. Krista, already struggling with low self-esteem and desperate for affection, became completely taken with him. Those who knew them described Ship as the one in control, the leader, while Krista trailed behind, eager to please him. He had a kind of dark charm, and she mirrored his behavior, even his darker moods, hoping it would make him love her more. Some students went even further in their accounts, saying Ship wasn't just controlling, he was abusive. There were rumors that he'd hit Krista, pushed her around, or talked down to her in public. The stories weren't always consistent, but they did paint a clear picture of a volatile young man who used aggression to get his way. For Krista, Ship's darkness wasn't something to fear, it was magnetic. She saw in him the strength, confidence, and edge that she felt she lacked, and for Ship, her admiration fed his ego. Together, they became locked in this intense, unhealthy connection, one that would soon spiral far beyond teenage rebellion. When Christa Pike got to Job Corps, she was searching for some kind of stability, but also for someone to care about her, a place to feel like she belonged. Ship became that person for her, at least in a way that made sense to an 18-year-old who craved attention and approval. Everything she felt and did started to orbit around Ship. For him, having her so devoted made him feel powerful and in charge, the kind of influence over someone that can quickly spiral into something dangerous. By the winter of 1995, the Daryl Ship was right on the edge of adulthood. In less than a year, he'd turn 18, the age when juvenile protections disappear and the adult world's expectations hit hard. But at 17, he was still technically a kid, stuck in that messy in-between of adolescence and growing up. Now let's talk about Colleen Slemmer. She's another person caught up in all of this, and her story really helps show what life was like at Job Corps and how the drama between Christa Pike and the Daryl Ship was playing out. Colleen Slemmer came into the world on September 30, 1975, and grew up in Florida with her mom, May Martinez. Life wasn't exactly fancy, but it was warm and full of love. People who knew her remembered her as a lively, funny girl who could light up a room with her smile and her sense of humor. She didn't have a life of privilege, but she wasn't ignored or neglected either. Her mom was always there for her, a steady presence she could rely on. That bond gave Colleen a real sense of belonging, a kind of anchor that would mean a lot later on. Colleen grew up in a Florida full of contrasts, sunny beaches and tourist crowds on one side, but also working class neighborhoods where families were just trying to get by. In Jacksonville, she was part of that later world, surrounded by kids whose families struggled but still hoped their children could make something of themselves. She went to Englewood High, a big public school with students from all walks of life. Colleen fit right in, friendly, easy to talk to, and someone who could keep her spirits up even when life around her was tough. She had this openness that made it easy for her to make friends and the curiosity that made her want to explore the world. She laughed easily, connected with people quickly, and carried herself with a mix of teen confidence and genuine kindness. Her friends also noticed her energy, a kind of restlessness that pushed her to chase adventure and new opportunities. Sure, she sometimes clashed with her family while figuring out her independence, but it all was grounded in love. She was still close to her mom and part of a family that wanted the best for her. By the early 90s, Colleen was hitting that point where adulthood was knocking. College wasn't really an option for her. Money and grades weren't lining up, but she wasn't about to just float through life. That's where Job Corps came in. The program offered vocational training, a chance to get her GED if she needed it, and skills that could actually help her make a living. So in 1994, at 19, Colleen headed to the Job Corps Center in Knoxville, Tennessee. She was a bit older than most of the other students, most were 16 or 17, but she was ready to focus on something real, figuring out how to build her future. When Colleen arrived at the Knoxville Job Corps, it was a whole new world compared to Florida. The center brought together young people from all over the South. Some were genuinely hoping for a fresh start, while others were basically sent there because their schools or families had given up on them. The place was a mix of structure and chaos. The staff tried to enforce rules and keep everyone on track, but in the dorms, the kids ran their own social scene. Cliques formed, power hierarchies popped up, and there was always tension simmering under the surface. It could be rough, but Colleen managed to navigate it. She stayed friendly and approachable, her natural warmth standing out among some of the harder, tougher students around her. Even in that unpredictable environment, she stayed focused on her goals. She threw herself into the program, determined to make something of it. Friends later said she was always talking about her plans for the future, the skills she wanted to pick up, and the life she hoped to build after finishing her training. She had a sense of direction that not everyone at Job Corps had, and she clung to it, trying to make the most of the opportunity in front of her. In the middle of that, Colleen made friends with a fellow student named Maurice. Their relationship gave her a sense of comfort and connection in a place that could feel really isolating at times. Being away from home, she leaned on the friendships she made and on Maurice to help her navigate the ups and downs of life at the center. It wasn't always easy, but having people to rely on made the experience more manageable. What really jumps out about Colleen, especially when you compare her to Christa, is just how different her foundation was. Christa grew up surrounded by chaos, neglect, and conflict, while Colleen's life, though far from perfect, had a sense of stability. She had a mom who loved her, friends who cared about her, and a personality that naturally leaned toward positivity rather than trouble. Colleen wasn't flawless, no teenager is, but she wasn't cruel or aggressive. Little did she know, though, her dreams were about to be ripped apart. Outside the walls of Job Corps, the paths of Christa, Tadeusz, and Colleen might never have crossed. By fall 1994, these three weren't just aware of each other. They were tangled up in a web of attraction, jealousy, and mistrust, a mix that would only grow more explosive as time went on. For Christa, Tadeusz wasn't just a boyfriend. He was her whole world, her validation, her sense of identity, her protector, all rolled into one. It was an uneven, intense dynamic, one that made Christa see any rival, real or imagined, as a threat she couldn't ignore. The first time Christa, Tadeusz, and Colleen really noticed each other wasn't anything dramatic. They just bumped into each other in the dorms, the cafeteria, and classes. Their paths crossed like any students would in a shared space. But it didn't take long for Christa to start seeing Colleen as more than just another student. To her, Colleen was a rival. Some say Christa thought Colleen was flirting with Tadeusz or showing interest in ways that made her jealous. Others suggest it wasn't really about Tadeusz at all, just Christa's own insecurities making her suspicious of someone who probably wasn't even a threat. The truth didn't really matter. In Christa's mind, Colleen had stepped over an invisible line, and from that point on, every interaction was loaded with tension, suspicion, and a growing sense of hostility. For Christa, who already had a fiery temper, the idea of someone else even looking at Tadeusz was unbearable. Colleen, on the other hand, had no clue why Christa was so mean. People who knew her later said she tried to smooth things over, even apologizing sometimes for things she hadn't done. But nothing worked. Christa's jealousy just kept growing, fueled by whispers, sideways glances, and the normal ups and downs of dorm life that she twisted into signs of betrayal. Being stuck together in the dorms didn't help. Gossip spread fast, and other students noticed the tension. What might have blown over in a normal school setting instead turned into this constant, low-level war simmering just beneath the surface. People tell different stories about Tadeusz's role. Some say he liked the attention and the way Christa's devotion spilled over into hostility toward Colleen. Others think he didn't really care either way, just focused on looking tough and keeping his own image. Either way, with him around and Christa's obsession in full swing, this rivalry wasn't going anywhere. It was like a powder keg just waiting to blow. By late 1994 and early 1995, things between the three had basically reached a breaking point. Christa had Colleen pegged as her enemy, Colleen was doing her best to stay out of Christa's way, and Tadeusz was stuck right in the middle. There are reports that during the winter break, Christa went home while Tadeusz and Colleen stayed at Job Corps. During this time, it seems like the two eventually did get together for a brief period of time in Christa's absence. When classes resumed and Christa learned about this, she became completely obsessed with Colleen. She couldn't stop thinking about her and started talking openly about confronting her, about needing to deal with the girl she thought was trying to come between her and Tadeusz. It was in this charged, tense atmosphere that Christa cooked up a plan. She framed it as a peace talk, a way to get Colleen off campus and settle things privately, away from the dorm drama. But Christa didn't go alone. Tadeusz was by her side, her boyfriend and partner in crime, and with them went Shadola Peterson, another Job Corps student who had gotten close to Christa and often found herself wrapped up in her world. On the evening of January 12, 1995, Colleen Slemmer was approached by Christa. Christa made it sound like she just wanted to work things out, a private chat away from the dorms and all the gossip swirling around. She told Colleen that she, Tadero, and Shadola were going off campus to smoke some Mary Jane, and it was a good opportunity to spend some time together and bury the hatchet. Even though she knew Christa could be intense and a little intimidating, Colleen seemed to go along with it. At some point, when the tensions were growing, she even told her mother that she had problems with a girl at Job Corps and was thinking of giving up and going back home. Her mom, not knowing the severity of the situation, told Colleen she should work things out and stay in the program. Maybe that's why Colleen decided to accept Christa's invitation.
I need to get home. I don't want to be here. I hate it. And I said, you can't. You signed a contract. You have to stay there.
Colleen ended up walking with Christa, Tadero, and Shadola, leaving the relative safety of campus behind and heading into the woods nearby. The four of them moved through the night, heading toward the quiet, isolated part of the woods near the University of Tennessee's agricultural campus. Colleen probably felt a little nervous, that uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach, but she had no idea just how dangerous this walk was about to get. Christa wasn't just out for a chat, she had a knife with her. This wasn't some random thing she happened to be carrying, it was intentional. The Daryl being there gave her confidence, and Shadola's presence made the whole thing look a bit more normal, like just a casual walk. From the outside, anyone watching would have seen four teenagers out for a stroll, but underneath it all, Christa's plan was already in motion. When they finally got to a quiet clearing, everything changed. What had been sold as a chance to work things out quickly turned into something completely different. Christa's anger, which had been brewing for weeks, exploded. She started yelling at Colleen, accusing her of going after Tadero, of trying to steal him away. Colleen denied the allegations, insisting she had no interest in him and had never meant to interfere. But Christa didn't care about what was true. She was living in the story her mind had created, and in that story, Colleen was the enemy. Christa, with Tadero right there backing her up, launched her attack on Colleen. That quiet little patch of woods instantly turned into a scene of chaos and terror.
What were they gonna do? Well, at first I thought they just were scared. At first, from the jump, that's what I thought. But we got after everything changed.
Colleen tried to talk her way out, begged for mercy, but nothing worked. Christa's anger only grew hotter. Shadola Peterson was there the whole time, but she didn't get physically involved. She just watched, frozen between fear and disbelief. Later, she described how Christa taunted Colleen, how merciless and brutal the attack was. Out of the four teenagers there, Shadola's role is the trickiest to understand. She didn't help plan it and she didn't carry out the violence, but she also didn't step in to stop it. Some see her as a follower, someone pulled into Christa's orbit, but too scared to go against her. In the intense, closed-off world at Job Corps, where loyalties and friendships meant a lot, crossing Christa and Tadero could have had serious consequences. Later on in court, Shadola's testimony ended up being crucial. She told the story of that night in chilling detail, giving investigators the clearest picture of exactly what happened and helping them piece together a timeline of the attack. But back in those woods in the moment, she was frozen. She just watched as something unfolded that would forever change everyone involved. The violence ended with Christa and Tadero making sure Colleen wouldn't be leaving that clearing alive. Christa brutally tortured her for about 30 minutes, taunting, beating, slashing, and even carving a pentagram into her chest.
There was a picture that was cut on her chest. Who did that? I did have that. All right, don't tell me what it was. It was satanic stuff.
Finally, Christa struck Colleen's skull with a heavy piece of asphalt, killing her. Shadola, standing off to the side, could only take it all in. She had gone into those woods with a group of four, thinking it was just a walk or a talk. She walked out, knowing that one of them would never come back. When it was finally over, the three who made it out, Christa, Tadero, and Shadola, started the walk back to the Knoxville Job Corps campus. The woods were quiet again, but the weight of what just happened hung over them like a shadow. Christa carried a strange sense of satisfaction. She even kept a piece of Colleen's skull. Tadero, quieter, moved with a cold kind of menace. You could tell he'd been involved, but his feelings were hard to read. Shadola, meanwhile, was trembling, horrified by everything she had seen, the confrontation, the attack, the sheer cruelty. She made it back to the dorms with them, but she carried a secret that couldn't stay hidden forever. Right after Colleen Slammer was killed, Christa Pike's carefully maintained facade started falling apart almost immediately. It was mainly her own doing, because she actually bragged about murdering Colleen and even showed others the piece of skull she had kept.
She was dancing around in a circle.
Who was dancing around in the circle?
Krista.
Dancing around the circle while she was telling you about this?
Yes.
Was she doing anything else?
She was smiling.
Making any other noises or anything?
She was kind of saying la la la.
Christa didn't try to fade into the background or avoid attention. The way the murder came to light was actually tied pretty closely to what Christa and Daryl did right after the crime. They didn't go all out trying to erase every trace of what happened. Some things connected to the attack were left behind, little pieces of evidence that, if someone looked closely, could be traced back to them. On top of that, Christa herself made it harder to stay hidden. She continued talking to friends and other people around her in ways that hinted she knew more than she should. Sometimes it was just offhand comments, things she probably thought sounded casual at the time, but in hindsight, they were incredibly incriminating. Investigators also noticed that while Christa seemed calm on the surface, it was really just a mask for a much more reckless side of her. She would occasionally make provocative statements, manipulate the conversation, or act in ways that almost dared people to question her. It was like she wanted to assert control over the situation, but every little move ended up drawing more attention instead. After the murder, her behavior showed a mix of disturbing lack of guilt, but also a constant drive to manage how others saw her. All of these things together, leaving evidence, talking too much, acting unpredictably, made her stand out. Bit by bit, those mistakes peeled back the cover, helping investigators connect the dots and unravel exactly what had happened that night.
I don't even think I was just blacked out because she made me so mad. And I just couldn't look her at doing this. And she was just going, please don't. I said, shut up, I don't want to talk to you, I don't want you to talk to me. I said, I just want to find some way to get out of this. I said, it's gone too far. I need to do what I've done so far.
When Christa Pike finally faced the courtroom, she carried herself with a mix of defiance and pride. Out in public, she put on a confident front, often staring down the room like she owned it, projecting a kind of fearlessness that made people take notice. But underneath that exterior, there were hints of tension, subtle signs that she fully understood the seriousness of what she'd done. During testimony, her answers could be sharp, sarcastic, or even a little performative, as if she was trying to dictate how everyone, the jurors, the lawyers, even the media, saw her. She seemed to want to stay in control of the story, to manage the way she was perceived, almost like she was performing for an audience instead of just answering questions. This behavior had a double effect. On one side, it made her seem cold and unrepentant, which obviously didn't help her in front of the jury. But on the other side, it gave everyone a clear window into who she was, impulsive, manipulative, and constantly looking out for herself. Every little move she made to control the situation, every sarcastic remark, only made that contrast between her confident facade and the reality of her crime sharper. It reinforced the image the prosecution was painting of her, as the one who had planned and driven the whole horrifying act. Combined with the hard evidence, it left little doubt, ultimately leading to her conviction and the imposition of the death sentence.
It is therefore ordered that you shall be put to death by electrocution in the mode prescribed by law, and that you shall be transferred to the custody of the warden at the Tennessee Prison for Women. And further, on the 12th day of January, 1997, your body shall be subjected to shock by a sufficient current of electricity. May God have mercy upon you. Mr. Bates, take Mr. Pike into the door.
Can I please have my mom before I go?
Mr. Bates, please hold Ms. Pike in the dock.
Please, let me just love my mom.
Please hold Ms. Pike in the dock.
I love you. I love you too. And I love you too.
The Darrell, who was 17 at the time of the murder, was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder. Because he was a juvenile at the time of the crime, he was not eligible for the death penalty. He received a life sentence with the possibility of parole plus 25 years. He became eligible for parole this month actually, after a hearing. The parole board denied his request for release and set his next review for October 2031. Colleen's mom opposed Shipp's parole and provided a statement to the board arguing against his release. Shadola, who was 19 during the murder, served as a lookout but later cooperated with prosecutors by turning state's evidence. She pleaded guilty to being an accessory after the fact. In exchange for her testimony against Christa and Darrell, she received a 6-year probationary sentence. She was eventually released from her probation and is no longer in the correctional system for this crime. The road to scheduling Christa's execution was anything but straightforward. After her conviction back in 1996, her defense team spent years fighting for clemency or a reduced sentence. They highlighted a long list of mitigating factors: the abuse and neglect she suffered as a child, untreated mental health issues like bipolar disorder and PTSD, SA, and even evidence of brain damage. These were all presented as reasons why her sentence should be reconsidered. Yet, despite decades of legal battles, appeals, and arguments about her troubled past, her death sentence held firm. One of the most recent attempts to challenge her sentence came after the Tennessee Supreme Court's November 2022 decision in the State v. Booker case. That ruling declared that automatic life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional, giving Christa's lawyers a new angle to try to reopen her case or reduce her sentence. But in October 2023, Knox County Judge Scott Green rejected that effort. He pointed out that Christa had been 18 at the time of the crime, making her legally an adult and therefore ineligible for relief under the Booker precedent. With that ruling, most of her legal options were exhausted. The decades-long appeals process had run its course, leaving the execution date as the next chapter in her story. Tennessee usually uses lethal injection as the standard method, but electrocution is still technically an option for inmates whose crimes happened before January 1, 1999. Christa falls into that group, which means that, in theory, she could choose electrocution if lethal injection isn't available or if she decided to go that route. Tennessee has only recently resumed executions after a pause caused by concerns over drug testing for lethal injections and the procedures surrounding them. Now, executions are under stricter rules to prevent mistakes. Part of the process includes the warden notifying Christa about the method that will be used, a procedural step that can also affect her final legal moves and how she prepares mentally for what's coming. Even with a date on the calendar, her execution isn't completely set in stone. There's still room for last-minute appeals, motions, or petitions for clemency. Her defense attorneys are likely to continue pushing on procedural and constitutional issues, and Tennessee's checkered history with execution protocols, especially questions about lethal injection, means the courts could still step in. These ongoing legal and procedural factors show just how complicated the mix of law, death row, and human rights can be in her situation. Christa's newly scheduled execution isn't just the end of a decades-long legal battle, it's also a rare and unusual moment in Tennessee's history. After all, she is the only woman on death row in the state. The last woman sentenced to death in Tennessee before her was Gail Owens. Her death sentence was commuted by then-Governor Phil Bredesen in 2010, and she died shortly after. Owens was convicted of hiring a hitman to kill her husband, Ron Owens, in 1984. Her case gained national attention due to claims of severe domestic abuse and controversy surrounding her death sentence. Christa is locked up at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville, Tennessee, which is the state's main prison for women. This facility houses women of all custody levels. Being the only woman on death row, her day-to-day life is defined by isolation and very limited social interaction. She spends most of her time alone in a single cell, with little contact with other inmates. This kind of solitary setup is standard for death row, meant to prevent escapes and keep order. Her attorneys tried multiple times to say that she is now a changed woman that deeply regrets her actions. Based on interviews that she gave in the past, I doubt that she feels sorry for what she did. I think her personality was shaped by her upbringing, and there's no way she knows what true empathy is. Look at this and tell me if you believe she has remorse.
I did something horrible that is unacceptable, and I realize that. But I don't deserve to die for the actions of 3 individuals.
It remains to be seen if Christa will actually be executed, but for now, her scheduled execution is making headlines. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.